The Smash roster just keeps growing and growing, which means that newcomers are going to keep getting stranger and stranger. And if anyone is going to get the brownie points for calling a pick ahead of time, it's gonna be me. If that line sounds oddly familiar, then that's because I did a similar vid where I already named 10 different characters who I feel would best suit the game. And if that line sounds familiar, it's because this is actually the third time around. Things got a little out of hand in the last video. I promise this one won't be as cringe. I'll be focusing on third-party characters, but nothing too nuts. To review, the only rules are to not just go for dream picks or predictables, but to pick characters who would best suit the game as a cultural keystone and a fun fighting game. Like I said, the theme this time around is going to be third-party characters, who would be unexpected but appropriate. Number 10. Batman and Spiderman. I may have lured you into a false sense of security. I do 20 plus characters vid, and this is the third one. We jumped the shark long ago, and top 10s always start with the dumbest pick, so we're going with these two. I'm not joking. I don't tell jokes. We'll never get Marvel vs. DC because there's too much legal BS in the way, so maybe Aether Zaibatsu in the form of Nintendo is just what we need to get things in gear. If you watched part 2, then you know that I actually try to give an argument to even my weirdest, most unexpected picks, and these two aren't an exception. While they don't originate from video games, they've always had a scene of adaptations that have influenced the world of gaming significantly. Open world games wouldn't be the same without Spider-Man 2, and Arkham's combat has become the default archetype for your average third-person AAA of today. As for movesets, Batman would definitely balance ranged specials with explosives and batarangs before rushing in with the Batclaw and martial arts, similar to his Injustice move pool, but with more air options. He could have the Railgun Glide from Arkham Knight for his Zot special, which would allow for a slow descent and off-stage play. Spider-Man would rely on his web-slinging to move around as a sort of super mobile grapple character. I would hope that his side special would be a tether grab so that he can still hang on to his regular limb-based one for his Z button. Other than that, he definitely has to have a counter for down special in the form of his Spider Sense, but I would hope it would do something special, like make him faster or more mobile instead of just dealing some damage. Naturally, they're lower on the list because they're a bit too ridiculous to be seriously considered, not to mention they've been adapted in their own fighting games before. But I caved into letting them onto number 10 because they'd make for a momentous trailer. Number 9. Here's one I think would lead to an incredibly interesting character mechanically with some seriously cerebral mind games. That's a pun you don't get yet, but I really enjoyed it. The reason they're so low on the list is because they don't really scream Nintendo or even a rival to Nintendo, but the game is good and it's on the Switch, so I'm counting it. I prefer the typical gray design from Enemy Unknown, but I'd like to see a human hybrid sectoid from XCOM 2 in Smash, almost exclusively because I see the grab as an adaptation of the Mind Slave ability. You'd force your foe to walk, jump, or crouch for a duration, literally overriding their controls. After that, you could turn down special into Overwatch with a counter modified to have a massive hurt box, extending long past the sectoid's body. It wouldn't do much damage or knockback, but if the opponent is airborne, then it could force them into freefall, similar to how the original game has the player robbing the AI out of their turn by flushing them into fire. Again, an unlikely pick that only made the list for something as trivial as fun video game mechanics. I doubt they'd actually make the cut, but it would be a pleasant surprise. Number 8. I mentioned Leon Kennedy before, but if you take the survivor out of the zombie apocalypse, you lose the horror. So I think it would be nice to get a classic monster. A typical zombie loses the star power, Mr. X doesn't have much tech other than punching, and Nemesis has been done before though. So instead of Resident Evil, I think it might be cool to give Silent Hill a shot. Even though Pyramid Head is a pretty iconic staple of horror, I hesitate to put him higher up, mostly because I worry he's a bit overmarketed. Pyramid Head's not a popcorn monster, he's the personification of James's murder guilt, so it might be a bit uncomfortable to have him square up with Kirby. With that said, it's not like he hasn't been misused before, so he just barely made the list off of genre, Dead by Daylight's crossover, and good gameplay potential. That gameplay being the idea of a horror monster that's scary to play against. I imagine he'd have fast, damaging, knockback heavy moves with long recovery to make neutral as stressful as possible. He'd be very vulnerable after all his attacks, but if they land, then he could act right away for follow-ups. He'd probably have to end up slower than Incineroar just for the sake of balance, but that'd be fun, scary, and it fits his vibe too. Number 7. One thing I really appreciate about the Ultimate cast in particular is all the new side characters and villains. It really fleshes out each game's presence to have more than one rep. Metroid has spooky monsters, and Donkey Kong Country is full of goofballs. But what one-rep game could use some fleshing out? Liquid or the Boss could show off some of the complicated clone-based conspiracies of Metal Gear. Miss Pac-Man could compliment her husband, or Tifa or Barrett could give Seven some character. But I think the best choice would be giving Sonic an antagonist to antagonize. The obvious pick is Shadow the Hedgehog, but if you give me Shadow, you'd better give him Time Stop and a Glock. And if you give him Time Stop and a Glock, then congrats, you've made a keep-away character that's more obnoxious than Sonic himself. That's why I think Dr. Eggman would be a more interesting pick. For his moveset, I think it would lead to more funny situations if he was actually just an obese man with terrible normals. But he could build a mech that would drastically increase his movement and attack power. Take too many hits and the machine would break down, and you'd start all over again. He would need to differentiate himself from Junior, so I think it would be best to avoid the little pod thing and go with the Walker from Adventure 2. That way I see him getting Peach's glide in the form of the hover boots, while still also getting a self-destruct for up special. That would actually be consequential since he'd need to find time to rebuild. Number 6. I have a lot of conflicting feelings about Bayonetta and Ultimate. On one hand, I'm a huge stan that never thought she'd make it in, so when she got added to 4, I was ecstatic. But then she turned out to be so incredibly busted that everyone hated you for picking her. What's worse is that now she's nerfed, so in addition to being unfun to play against, she's also unfun to play as. It's unfortunate that my favorite studio somehow got bad vibes from this exchange. Maybe Platinum can have a do-over? Jack from MadWorld might be easier to adapt than Bayo, since he's less combo-focused and more about sadistic theater than elaborate strings. He'd probably be a sick grappler, stuffing people into barrels and then impaling them with a signpost. You'd have to get rid of the blood, which is a big part of the art style, but I still maintain that there should be M-rated games repped in Smash, even if they have to be toned down. The black and white costume would still be sick, and if we get MadWorld's soundtrack, then I'd be very satisfied. Number 5. I've mentioned before how weird it is that we don't have an FPS rep out of someone like Samus, but I guess it makes sense. One of the big no-nos for making it into the game is that you can't use realistic firearms, so if anyone is going to make the jump, they're going to have to be either fantasy or sci-fi. For the next 2 picks, we're going to be focusing on that second one. You also don't want your FPS guy to just be a keep-away character, so for my number 5 slot, I gotta give it up to Gordon Freeman. Sure, he uses ranged weapons, but his signature stuff is all more gimmicky. He's got a super fast crowbar for normals, a gravity gun for grabs, and that's not to mention all his crazy stuff from Half-Life 1. If we're lucky, maybe he can even steal Snake's rocket launcher, making room for Project M's tranquilizer, but I'm probably a broken record about that at this point. I'd be willing to trade Gordon for Shell because I'd be interested to see how portals work in a platform fighter, but her moveset doesn't lend itself to violence quite as well. Either way, it'd be cool to see stuff coming out of Valve again. If we're lucky, Alex could be the start of a big comeback. Number 4. If a more traditional FPS is more of your jam, then there's one obvious spaceman that just missed out on the bronze medal. He ranks pretty high because he's an iconic character from an unrep genre, but he hasn't shown up before because he's not very Nintendo and might be difficult to adapt. I also took some points off because Arbiter, who is honestly a better pick, was already in Killer Instinct, but Master Chief still has never been in a fighting game proper, so here he is. It's unreal how drastically characters like Joker have changed my perspective of viable candidates. While he does have an energy sword, I think it's unavoidable that he's going to have to be a keep-away character that would rather maintain distance than getting in close. But I also think that it would be nice for him to have an air grab to adapt his ability to hijack airborne vehicles. On top of that, he should have a slow, powerful, and horizontal sniper rifle move that covers grounded options. Throw in a Warthog or a Banshee for Final Smash, and we got an exciting crossover on our hands. Number 3. I tend to give indies extra points on these lists just because it's so thrilling to see a small group of devs have their art immortalized in such a big way. Number 3 goes to a character who somehow managed to cross over with Nintendo already after only 1 game. I mentioned a Rhythm Heaven Fever fighter in the previous vid, since I really want a rhythm game rep. And while I think I prefer that series overall, I feel that Cadence from Crypt the NecroDancer would make for a more natural fit. Not only does she come from a rhythm game with consistent world building and lore, but also from a roguelike with weapons and loadout customization. I'll not speculate too in depth about normals and specials, but I'd be really interested to see how the stranger weapons like the weird-ass whip and throwable dagger would be implemented. The main reason I put her up so high is because I see her as a more not shit version of Hero. closer to Shovel Knight from Rivals. Her neutral special would play the Golden Loot, which would be a tiny AoE that nets you gold coins. For down special, or maybe even on death, you'd enter a shop where you can pick an upgrade like glass weapons that do extra damage so long as you don't get hit, blood weapons that heal you if you get a streak without taking damage, or even gold weapons that power up your attacks if you precede them with the loot. The catch is that you'd have to upgrade each weapon individually. For example, if you wanted your down smash to heal you, you'd need to build up gold and buy the blood whip, thereby signaling your move ahead of time. I imagine that would lead to some interesting exchanges. Number 2! It feels like it's been forever since we got a new lightweight character. I guess the most recent would have to be Isabelle, but she's closer to Marth than she is to Kirby. It's lucky that there just so happens to be a real popular character that fits the archetype, who also gets a lot of points for being an indie rep on the Switch with a highly anticipated sequel on the way. You'd have to scale up the knight to Olimar's size, but once he's big enough, he's got a very immediately obvious moveset. I've always really liked his down slash functioning as a pogo jump that also refreshes your double jump and air dash. His normals would all be quick and combo focused, but I think the real interesting tech comes from his soul meter. Build up percentage with tons of quick attacks, and then cash that out with knockback heavy spells. You'll have to be sure to combo into the good stuff though, because if you miss, you'll have to build it up all over again. If that seems a bit too simple and honest for a character this late in the game though, I wouldn't mind trading him in for Hornet from Silksong. Though I don't know if a more complex moveset is inherently any better. I mean, I'd take both. Why not both? Do both. To review, number 10, Marvel's Spiderman and DC's Batman. Number 9, 2K's Sectoid. Number 8, Konami's Pyramid Head. Number 7, Sega's Dr. Eggman. Number 6, Platinum's Jack Kamen. Number 5, Valve's Gordon Freeman. Number 4, Microsoft's Master Chief. Number 3, Brace Yourself Games' Cadence. Number 2, Team Cherry's Hollow Knight. And my number 1 pick is not going to be revealed yet. We still have 10 more to go. Can't forget about the honorable mentions. I like the idea of throwing in snip and clip, but ultimately I just didn't think that you could get your character up in a way that wasn't just jank to fight against. The idea of creating a sharp edge for an attack seems cool at first, but if you asked me to do it while fighting off a Ganondorf, I'd fumble the controls for sure. Francis York Morgan would be hilarious, but I doubt he could do anything more interesting than tanking the frame rate. Maybe rolling a bowling ball for a neutral special? It'd make more sense than Villager. I would be disappointed if each taunt weren't a lengthy movie review monologue. The Prince of Persia could rewind time, but I already kinda went over that type of moveset when I mentioned Tracer in the previous vid. Honestly though, if we're getting any time traveler, the obvious pick is to go for Chrono. In addition to rewinding his own movements, he could throw out dual techs, maybe even synergizing with himself hopping back in time. If you want to get real crazy, then maybe he can even regain stocks by going back and saving himself at the last second. Kamek or Birdo could give Yoshi someone to bounce off of, but Mario already kinda dominates the roster, and that's kind of an unexciting pick after Piranha Plant. I'd really like a character from Fallout, but since there's no iconic dude from a marketing perspective, the best I could think of was a generic Deathclaw, which, while badass, doesn't reflect the best the series has to offer. It'd be cool to irradiate foes, but status doesn't work so well with what would inevitably be a rushdown character. Maybe we could just pretend the monster knew how to use VATS. It'd be funny to figure out what happens when you break Jigglypuff's fucking legs. Lara Croft is iconic, but kinda just a gun person with a grapple, so I doubt she'd be very fun to play as or against. You'd need to get creative with her to make her anything at all. Ring Fit Trainee would be a lot more interesting than Wii Fit Trainer, but would also seem redundant, so maybe they're best left alone. Crash Bandicoot got robbed of a spot on the list, but again, I don't think he'd stand out all that much on the roster. They'd have to incorporate some stuff from Crash Team Racing or something. Excite Biker is overdue for some time in the sun, but he still suffers from no moveset potential other than riding his bike fast. The real tragedy is that he hasn't crossed over into a Mario Kart game yet. And number 1, Tony Hawk! That's a joke pick. I've picked up telling jokes. I wouldn't put him on the list proper. I've been responsible for some ridiculousness in the past, but putting an IRL human being in the video game is beyond cringe. If you're going to be a killjoy, I'd go for Raichu, if for nothing else than to help with the OCD of completing the set. His neutral special could take inspiration from the Thunder Wave alternate move from Smash 4, where it does even less damage than Pikachu's Jolt, but with more stun. That way, each evolution would show a better understanding of controlling the electricity. If you want to get real crazy, you could make his Thunder go backwards, starting at Raichu and then ascending. That way you could read the DI following his up throw and actually land the string on human opponents. But let's not oversell ourselves on another Echo. Alright, enough stalling. On to number 1. Number 1, Sora from Kingdom Hearts, is a character I actively never want to make it into the game. Nothing against you if you love him, but I feel it would be a bad look to celebrate a character who relies so heavily on references to an entirely different medium in the video game. Video games already have a big enough chip on their shoulder trying to compete with movies, so despite how novel it would be to have a direct line from Mario to Tron, it'd be best to ignore that temptation. However, I bring this up because there is a Disney-owned character who has very much influenced the medium in a major way that I'd like to argue in favor of, besides Spidey. Shovel Knight's Shovel Knight and Hollow Knight's Knight might have put up a fight alright, but they owe a lot to a certain copyright. The gold medal goes to Scrooge McDuck from the influential NES game. The pogo jump is his move, so anytime you see that in a platformer, it's a send up to this guy. If I were playing it safe, I'd be talking about Cranky Kong, who inherited the move in Tropical Freeze and has his own legacy as the first Mario villain. But this is the number 1 slot, so it's time to be bold and push the OG. The down air wouldn't change Scrooge's momentum until it lands a hit, so you could safely throw it out off stage. But it would spike, making it extremely deadly. For down special, he'd tee up a rock and hit it with a golf swing, which would offer a nice arcing projectile. And for down throw, he'd substitute the projectile with his opponent. I imagine he'd be very deadly once he got his opponent off stage. These videos are long to edit and ain't great at getting views, but they kill my writer's block, so here we are. With 12 new medal winners, runners-up, and mentions each, that's a total of 99 candidates covered in the series. For number 100, I look to you, humble viewer. Post your best arguments for your worst candidates in the comments, and make sure to like this video, or else I'll make another one. Catch you next time.